The massive chamber stretched out like a cathedral made of crystal and starlight. Ambassador Taemin stood in the center of the room wearing his best diplomatic uniform. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. Around him towered 7 alien representatives, each one more strange and magnificent than anything Earth had ever imagined. The Vorthak delegate looked like a living mountain of blue crystal. Light moved through its body in slow patterns that hurt to watch for too long. To his left sat the Kalani ambassador. She was tall and graceful with silver skin that seemed to flow like liquid metal. Her forearms moved in perfect harmony as she adjusted the translation device on her elegant neck. Above them all floated the ancient Thessian. Nobody knew how old this being was. Some said it had been alive when humans were still learning to use fire. Its body was pure energy contained, in a shell that looked like flowing water. When it spoke, the entire chamber vibrated with power. Taemin had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. Earth had sent their best diplomats, their smartest scientists, and their most peaceful representatives. They had spent decades trying to prove that humanity deserved a place among the stars. Now everything came down to this single moment. Su Jin watched from the observation deck high above the main floor. She was Earth's chief xenobiologist and had spent years studying alien cultures. Her job was to help humanity understand these incredible beings. But now she could only watch as her planet's future was decided by creatures that seemed like gods compared to humans. She pressed her face against the transparent wall that separated the observers from the main chamber. Below her, Taemin looked so small and fragile. The alien delegates seemed to ignore him completely. They spoke to each other in languages that sounded like music or thunder or the whisper of wind through leaves. The chamber had been built to impress visitors. The walls showed images of great cities on distant worlds, floating gardens that stretched across entire continents, space stations the size of moons where billions of beings lived in perfect harmony, ships that could travel between galaxies in the blink of an eye, art and music and literature that made human achievements look like the work of children. This was what humanity wanted to join. The Galactic Council represented 47 different species spread across thousands of worlds. They had eliminated war, poverty, disease, and even death itself. Their technology could reshape matter at the atomic level. Their scientists could predict the movement of stars millions of years into the future. Their philosophers had answered questions that humans were still learning how to ask. For 23 years, Earth had been trying to prove they belonged here. They had sent gifts of art and music. They had shared their scientific discoveries. They had opened their planet to alien visitors and students. They had reformed their governments, eliminated their weapons, and dedicated themselves to peace. It had not been easy. Many humans had died during the Great Disarmament. Wars had been fought over the decision to join the Council. Entire nations had collapsed when they gave up their militaries. But humanity had persevered because they believed the sacrifice was worth it. Now Jin-ho stood in the back of the observation deck watching everything unfold. He was young for a military strategist, only 28 years old. But he had been chosen to observe these proceedings because Earth's leaders wanted someone who could think about strategy and tactics, someone who could understand the military implications of whatever decision the Council made. He did not like what he was seeing. The alien delegates barely looked at the human ambassador. They spoke about Earth as if humans were not even in the room. Their tone was dismissive, condescending. They treated humanity like a curiosity rather than potential equals. The Vorthak delegate finally turned its attention to Taemin. Its voice sounded like wind blowing through a cave full of crystals. The translation device turned its words into something humans could understand. Your species has been under observation for 47 of your years. We have studied your history, your culture, your biology, and your psychology. We have watched how you interact with each other and with other species. We have examined your technological development, your artistic achievements, and your philosophical progress. Taemin straightened his shoulders. He had practiced his response to this moment hundreds of times. Whatever the Council said, he was ready to defend humanity with dignity and grace. The Kalani ambassador spoke next. Her voice was like silver bells ringing in harmony. You have shown Remarkable progress in some areas. Your art displays creativity that surprises us. Your scientific methods show promise despite their primitive nature. Your capacity for individual growth gives us hope that your species might one day evolve beyond its current limitations. Hope flickered in Su Jin's chest. This sounded positive. Maybe humanity had done enough. Maybe their sacrifices had been worth it after all. But then the Thessian spoke and hope died. However, your species displays characteristics that make you unsuitable for membership in our alliance. You show excessive aggression even in your peaceful pursuits. Your history is marked by constant warfare, violence, and destruction. Even when you attempt to create, you seem compelled to destroy. Your literature celebrates conflict. Your entertainment glorifies violence. Your sports are competitions designed to determine dominance rather than harmony. The other delegates began to speak in turn. Each one listed more reasons why humanity was not ready. They talked about human unpredictability. They mentioned how humans would find violent solutions to problems that required delicate handling. They worried about human creativity, calling it dangerous because it was impossible to predict or control. Your technological development follows aggressive patterns. You create tools of war before tools of peace. You explore space not from curiosity, but from a desire to expand and conquer. Your first instinct when meeting something new is to determine whether it is a threat or a resource to be exploited. Taimin tried to speak, but the delegates continued without pause. Your species lacks the emotional stability required for peaceful coexistence. You form tribal groups that compete for resources even when abundance is available. You cannot seem to exist without creating enemies, either real or imaginary. Your psychology is built around concepts of competition, domination, and survival that have no place in a civilized society. The final judgment came from all 7 delegates speaking in unison. Their combined voices shook the chamber like thunder. Humanity is denied membership in the Galactic Council. Your species will be quarantined to your home system. No trade agreements will be established. No technology transfers will be permitted. No communication channels will remain open except for emergency humanitarian purposes. Furthermore, humanity is forbidden from expanding beyond your solar system. Any attempt to establish colonies or outposts beyond your system's boundaries will be considered an act of aggression against the Council and will be met with appropriate force. This quarantine will remain in effect until such time as humanity demonstrates fundamental changes to its nature. This decision is final and cannot be appealed. The chamber fell silent. Taimin stood alone in the center of the room. His planet's dreams of joining the galactic community had just died. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed, had been for nothing. As the human delegation was escorted from the chamber, Jinho heard 2 council members speaking quietly to each other. They thought no humans were close enough to understand their conversation. But Jinho had been trained to listen, and his translation device was more advanced than they realized. The species will likely destroy itself within 1 generation. Isolation tends to increase aggressive tendencies in primitive civilizations. We should monitor their system for signs of ecological collapse or nuclear warfare. It is unfortunate. They showed such promise in some areas, but their fundamental nature cannot be changed. Perhaps in a few thousand years their descendants will be more suitable for contact. Taimin walked toward the exit with his head held high. At the doorway he turned back to face the council delegates. His voice was calm, but there was something hard in his eyes that had not been there before. You may regret this decision more than we will. Then he was gone, and humanity was alone among the stars once again. 20 years had passed since the council's rejection. Nari stood on the observation deck of Luna Station, watching cargo ships move between Earth and the asteroid belt like busy insects. She was now the director of the Sol Development Initiative, and the view before her showed what humanity had built from nothing but stubbornness and necessity. The ships looked nothing like the elegant council vessels they had once hoped to fly alongside. These were bulky working craft built from asteroid, metal and powered by fusion reactors that humans had designed themselves. They were ugly and loud and inefficient by galactic standards, but they worked and they were entirely human. Nari remembered the dark years right after the quarantine began. Earth had prepared for peace and cooperation. Suddenly they found themselves alone with limited resources and no hope of outside help. Many people had despaired. Some had called for revenge against the Council. Others had wanted to give up entirely and retreat into isolation. But humanity had done what it always did when, faced with impossible odds. They had rolled up their sleeves and gotten to work. The asteroid belt stretched out before her like a three-dimensional city. Mining stations and processing facilities dotted the space between Mars and Jupiter. Thousands of workers lived permanently in the belt now. They had children who had never set foot on a planet. They had built schools and hospitals and recreation centers inside hollowed-out asteroids. It had started as a necessity. Earth needed materials to build their new space infrastructure. The moon could only provide so much metal and rare elements. But the asteroids contained everything humanity needed to become truly independent. Iron and nickel for construction, platinum for electronics, water ice for fuel, and life support. What had begun as simple mining operations had evolved into something much more impressive. The belt workers had developed new techniques for processing materials in zero gravity. They had learned to build massive structures without the need for planetary foundations. They had created closed-loop life support systems that could sustain communities for decades without resupply. Mars was humanity's greatest success story. 3 million people now called the Red Planet home. The cities were built underground to protect against radiation, but they were real cities with parks and theaters and universities. Children ran through corridors that stretched for miles beneath the surface. Gardens provided fresh food using soil that had been carefully developed over 2 decades. The Martian colonies were completely self-sufficient. They manufactured their own equipment, recycled their own air and water, and grew their own food. When sandstorms raged on the surface for months at a time, the underground cities continued to thrive. They had backup systems for their backup systems, and manual controls for everything important. Dongsu had spent his entire career making this happen. He was the chief engineer of the Titan shipyards, and his teams had designed most of the vessels now moving through the solar system. His office was located inside a converted asteroid that had been hollowed out and spun to provide artificial gravity. The shipyards around Saturn were his proudest achievement. Using materials from the rings and moons, his crews had built the largest construction facility in human space. The ships they produced were not beautiful, but they were incredibly tough. They could operate for years without maintenance. They could be repaired using common materials and simple tools. Every vessel was designed with the assumption that help might not be available. Redundant systems made sure that losing one component would not cripple the entire ship. Manual backups meant that crews could still function even if their computers failed. Multiple power sources ensured that running out of fuel would not be a death sentence. Dongsu often thought about the council ships he had seen in old recordings. They were works of art that moved through space like living things, but they depended on regular maintenance from specialized facilities. They needed exotic materials that could only be produced using advanced technology. They were magnificent but fragile. Human ships were different. They were built like the old ocean vessels that had carried explorers across Earth's seas centuries ago. They were sturdy and reliable and could keep working under conditions that would destroy more advanced craft. Ye-Jin had watched all of this development with fascination and growing pride. She had been a translator for the Council before, choosing to remain with humanity after the quarantine. As one of the few people who understood both human and alien cultures, she provided a unique perspective on what was happening. She maintained the hidden monitoring stations that tracked Council communications. It was technically illegal, but the Council seemed to have forgotten about humanity entirely. Their messages painted a picture of a civilization that was beginning to show cracks. Several member worlds were experiencing resource shortages. Their advanced recycling systems were breaking down, and they lacked the industrial capacity to replace them quickly. Their centralized government was struggling to coordinate responses across dozens of different species and star systems. Some worlds were reporting social unrest. Species that had been peaceful for centuries were beginning to argue about resource allocation and territorial rights. The Council's response was to send peacekeeping fleets and diplomatic missions, but these solutions were not working as well as they once had. Jin found it ironic that the same problems the Council had predicted would destroy humanity were now affecting their own civilization. The difference was that humans had been forced to develop solutions while the Council had assumed their advanced technology would prevent problems from occurring. Meanwhile, Jin was making discoveries that worried everyone who heard about them. He led Earth's xenoarchaeology program and spent his time studying the ruins that previous civilizations had left behind on various worlds and asteroids throughout the solar system. Most people did not know that Earth's solar system had once been home to another intelligent species. The evidence was subtle and scattered, but it was definitely there. Ancient structures on Mars that were too regular to be natural. Unusual mineral deposits on several asteroids that showed signs of industrial processing. Strange electromagnetic signatures from deep space that suggested the remains of massive construction projects. The previous inhabitants had been technologically advanced. Their ruins showed evidence of energy manipulation techniques that human science was only beginning to understand. They had built cities and ships and monuments that had lasted for millions of years. But they were gone. Something had destroyed them so completely that only traces remained. Jin had found references in their surviving records to something they called the Devourers. The warnings were fragmentary and difficult to translate, but they spoke of an ancient enemy that consumed entire civilizations. The aliens who had lived in this system before humans had been powerful enough to reshape worlds and travel between stars. If something had been able to destroy them completely, then it represented a threat that neither humanity nor the Council was prepared to face. Jin kept his discoveries classified, but he shared them with a small group of military analysts and government officials. They began quietly preparing contingency plans and developing new defensive technologies. If the Devourers were real, and if they ever returned, humanity would need every advantage they could get. But for now, life in the solar system continued to improve. Europa's ice mines provided fuel for the growing fleet of exploration vessels. The outer system colonies were pushing the boundaries of what was possible with available technology. Generation ships were being designed for eventual journeys to nearby star systems. Humanity had been rejected by the galactic community, but they had not given up on reaching for the stars. They were building their own path forward, one small step at a time. They were learning to be truly independent and self-reliant in ways that the Council species had forgotten. Nari smiled as she watched another cargo convoy departing for the outer system. The ships were loaded with supplies for new colonies that would soon become self-sufficient communities. Each one was a small victory against the isolation that had been imposed on humanity. The Council had expected humans to destroy themselves within a generation. Instead, they had built something remarkable. They had proven that civilization could exist without perfection, and that strength could come from struggling against adversity rather than avoiding it entirely. The question now was whether this hard-won independence would be enough when the real test came. Because in the depths of space, something ancient was beginning to stir. Something that had been sleeping for millions of years was slowly awakening. And when it finally opened its eyes, humanity would discover whether 20 years of preparation had been enough to face a threat that had once consumed entire galaxies. The silence was what Jin noticed first. For 15 years, he had been monitoring deep space communications from Earth's hidden observation posts scattered throughout the outer solar system. The Vorthak had always been the most talkative species in the Council. Their crystal bodies transmitted data, constantly sharing information about trade routes, stellar conditions, and cultural exchanges. But for 3 days now, their frequencies had been completely quiet. Jin sat in the cramped monitoring station built inside a hollow asteroid beyond Pluto's orbit. Banks of receivers and analyzers filled every available space. The air recyclers hummed constantly, and the artificial gravity was barely strong enough to keep his coffee from floating away. It was not a glamorous assignment, but it was vital work. He adjusted the long-range sensors and swept the frequencies one more time. Nothing. The Vorthak homeworld of Crystallis had gone completely dark. No shipping reports, no weather updates, no cultural broadcasts. Even their automated navigation beacons had stopped transmitting. This was unprecedented. In all the years of monitoring council communications, he had never seen an entire species simply stop talking. The Vorthak were obsessive about maintaining contact with their scattered colonies and trading partners. Their crystal biology made them natural communicators who shared information the way humans breathed. Wu Jin activated the quantum relay that would carry his report back to Earth at faster than light speeds. It was one of humanity's few advanced technologies developed during their isolation. The message would reach the Seoul Development Authority in less than 6 hours. But by the time his report arrived, the situation had gotten much worse. The next day, the Krillian frequencies went silent. These were the builders of the Council's greatest engineering marvels. Their massive construction fleets had built space elevators that reached from planetary surfaces to orbital rings. Their cities were works of art that housed billions of beings in perfect harmony with their environments. Now they were gone too. Within a week, the entire Zeta Reticuli sector had fallen silent. 7 different species representing dozens of worlds, and hundreds of colonies had simply vanished from the communication networks. The few automated distress signals that escaped before the silence fell painted a terrifying picture. Something was consuming them. On Earth, the emergency meetings began. Immediately, President Young Mi convened the Planetary Defense Council in the deep bunkers beneath Geneva. Representatives from Mars Luna and the Belt colonies participated through secure quantum links. The asteroid mining crews suspended operations to bring their ships closer to the inner system. The reports coming from the monitoring stations grew more disturbing every day. Council emergency broadcasts were flooding the remaining communication channels. The messages were fragmentary and often cut off in mid-transmission, but they told a story that chilled everyone who heard them. The ancient enemy had returned. Something called the Devourers was moving through council space like a plague. They consumed not just matter and energy, but the very technology that advanced civilizations depended upon. Worlds that had existed for thousands of years were being reduced to lifeless rocks in a matter of days. Byung-ho had been Earth's chief military analyst for 12 years. His job was to study potential threats and develop defensive strategies. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. He stood before the assembled Defense Council with holographic displays showing the pattern of destruction spreading through council space. The Devourers move in organized fleets of bioships that appear to be grown rather than built. They can drain power from any technological device within a certain range. Council reports describe their vessels as living organisms that can adapt to different forms of attack within hours of first contact. The tactical displays showed the progression of the invasion. Each conquered system followed the same pattern. First, the communication networks would fail as the Devourers drained power from the relay stations. Then the defense platforms would go dark one by one. Finally, the planets themselves would fall silent as their cities lost power, and their populations fled or died. What made it worse was how completely helpless the Council forces seemed to be. These were species that could manipulate matter at the quantum level. They had weapons that could crack planets and shields that could deflect the energy of entire stars. Their military technology was so advanced that humans could barely understand how it worked. But none of it mattered against an enemy that could simply drain the power from their equipment. The Vorthak Defense Fleet had been the pride of the Council. Military. 300 crystalline warships armed with weapons that could vaporize asteroids. They had met the Devourer fleet in open space, confident that their superior firepower would carry the day. The battle had lasted exactly 17 minutes. Intercepted transmissions from the few surviving Council ships painted a picture of complete technological failure. Energy weapons that simply stopped working. Shields that collapsed without warning. Ships that went dead in space as their power cores were somehow drained from impossible distances. The Devourers had not even needed to destroy the Council ships. They had simply made them helpless, then moved on to consume the planets and space stations that no longer had any defense. Minji had been promoted to admiral just 2 years earlier, when humanity expanded their defense fleet. She was young for such a responsibility, but the isolation years had forced humans to promote people based on ability, rather than age or political connections. Now she found herself studying tactical reports that described the destruction of civilizations that had seemed invincible. She stood in the war room of the Mars Defense Command, watching the holographic displays that showed the advancing wave of destruction. Each conquered system was marked in red. Each day the red zone grew larger, the pattern was becoming clear. The Devourers were not random destroyers. They moved with purpose and intelligence. They targeted the most advanced civilizations, first consuming their technology and resources before moving on to less developed worlds, which meant humanity was probably next on their list. But as Minji studied the reports, she began to see something that gave her hope. The Council's greatest advantages were exactly what made them vulnerable to this enemy. Their centralized power systems could be drained from a distance. Their standardized technology could be countered once the Devourers learned how it worked. Their reliance on energy weapons left them helpless when those weapons stopped functioning. Everything that made the Council reject humanity 20 years ago might be exactly what humanity needed to survive this threat. Human technology was crude and inefficient by galactic standards, but it was also decentralized, robust, and difficult to disable completely. Human weapons relied on chemical energy and kinetic force rather than exotic energy fields. Human ships could operate on backup power for weeks if necessary. Most importantly, human thinking was chaotic and unpredictable. The Council species had evolved beyond the need for warfare. They thought in terms of efficiency and standardization. But humans still remembered how to fight dirty. The quantum relay networks brought increasingly desperate messages from the remaining Council worlds. Their perfect civilizations were crumbling as the Devourers consumed system after system. The species that had once dismissed humanity as too primitive and violent were discovering that advancement and peace were luxuries they could no longer afford. Some messages were addressed directly to Earth, though officially the quarantine was still in effect. They were requests for information about human defensive capabilities, offers of trade and technology sharing, hints that the Council might be willing to reconsider humanity's application for membership. But the most telling messages were the ones that were not meant for human ears. Minji listened to intercepted communications between Council military commanders. Their tone was desperate and increasingly panicked. Our weapons are useless against them. They adapt to everything we throw at them within hours. Our greatest ships are nothing but expensive targets. We need new approaches, new tactics. We need help from someone who thinks differently than we do. The irony was not lost on anyone in the human command structure. The same species that had called humanity too dangerous for civilized society were now desperately hoping that human violence and unpredictability might save them from extinction. President Young Mi called for a vote on whether humanity should respond to the Council's unofficial requests for assistance. The debate was fierce and emotional. Many people remembered the humiliation of the quarantine. They remembered friends and family who had died during the difficult transition years when humanity was forced to become self-sufficient. Why should we help them after they abandoned us? Let them face this threat with their superior technology and advanced civilization. Maybe they will understand what it means to be alone when the universe turns hostile. But others argued for a different approach. They pointed out that if the Council fell, humanity would face the Devourers alone. Better to fight alongside former enemies than to face extinction alone. The deciding argument came from an unexpected source. Tae-ho was Ambassador Tae-min's son, and had inherited his father's position as Earth's senior diplomat. But unlike his father, he had grown up during the quarantine years. Ambassador Hyun-woo had not expected to receive an official transmission from the Galactic Council ever again. For 21 years, the communication channels had been closed except for dire emergencies. Now his personal communicator was flashing, with an urgent priority message that carried the official seals of all 7 remaining Council species. He activated the holographic display in his office aboard Luna Station. The figure that appeared was not one of the proud delegates he remembered from the rejection ceremony. This being looked exhausted and desperate. Its usually perfect robes were torn and stained. Its 4 arms trembled as it spoke. The message was from Dalsu, who had been appointed as the Council's emergency coordinator when their normal government structure collapsed under the weight of the crisis. His species, the Kalani, had always been the most diplomatic of the Council races. But now his silver skin had lost its lustrous shine, and his voice carried a tone that Hyunwoo had never heard from any council member before. Fear. Respected representatives of humanity, we come before you in our darkest hour to request assistance that we know we have no right to ask for. The ancient enemy that our predecessors warned us about has returned with a hunger that consumes entire civilizations. 43% of council space has already fallen to the devourers. Dalsu paused, and his image flickered as power fluctuations interrupted the transmission from whatever facility he was broadcasting from. Our unified defense networks have proven completely vulnerable to their adaptation capabilities. Our standardized weapons and centralized command structures have become liabilities rather than advantages. The enemy learns from every engagement, and within hours our most advanced defensive systems become useless against them. Hyunwoo watched the transmission with growing amazement. This was the same species that had called humanity too primitive for civilized contact. The same beings who had dismissed human military thinking as crude and barbaric. Now they were begging for help from the very people they had rejected. We know we have no right to ask this of you. We isolated your species unjustly. We denied you the friendship and cooperation that you sought in good faith. We called you dangerous and unpredictable when we should have recognized these qualities as strengths that we ourselves had lost through centuries of peace and standardization. The transmission continued with detailed reports of the destruction spreading through council space. Entire star systems had been stripped of all technological civilization. Populations that had numbered in the billions were either dead or reduced to Stone Age survivors on worlds that no longer had power grids or communication networks. But it was not just the scale of the destruction that shocked Hyunwoo. It was the complete helplessness of the council forces. These were species that could reshape matter at the molecular level. They had technology that seemed like magic to human observers. Their warships could destroy planets, and their defenses could withstand the explosion of stars. None of it mattered against an enemy that could drain the power from their equipment and adapt to their tactics faster than they could develop new ones. The Krillian home fleet numbered over 2,000 vessels, each one a masterpiece of engineering that had taken decades to construct. They were armed with weapons that could crack moons and protected by shields that had never failed in 3 centuries of operation. The entire fleet had been rendered helpless in less than 2 hours. The message ended with a plea that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Dalsu was formally requesting that humanity provide military assistance to the Galactic Council. He was offering technology transfers, trade agreements, and full membership in exchange for help against the Devourers. But most importantly, he was admitting that the Council needed human thinking. They needed people who could approach problems from angles that their advanced civilizations had forgotten. They needed warriors who remembered how to fight dirty, and commanders who could adapt when their plans fell apart. President Young Mi called an emergency session of the Planetary Council within hours of receiving the transmission. Representatives from every major human settlement gathered in the secure conference chamber, deep beneath the lunar surface. The debate that followed would determine not just humanity's response to the crisis, but their entire future relationship with the galaxy. The chamber was filled with voices raised in anger and argument. Many representatives remembered the dark years after the quarantine when humans had struggled and died to build their new civilization without outside help. They remembered the children who had grown up without access to council medical technology. They remembered the explorers who had died in ships that could have been safer with better materials and equipment. Counselor Sang-mi from the Martian colonies spoke for many when she stood to address the assembly. She was a woman who had lost her husband during the early terraforming efforts, when a life support failure could have been prevented with council technology. They rejected us when we came to them in peace. They called us violent and dangerous. They quarantined us like we were some kind of disease. Now their perfect civilization is crumbling, and suddenly they remember that we exist. Why should we risk human lives to save people who would not lift a finger to help us when we needed them? But others argued for a different approach. General Park Ho from the Belt Defense Force pointed out that humanity could not survive alone. If the Devourers consumed the entire council, the enemy would eventually reach human space, and Earth would face them without allies or advance warning. More importantly, some representatives saw this as an opportunity to prove that humanity belonged among the stars. For 21 years they had been building their strength and developing their capabilities. Now they had a chance to show the galaxy what humans could accomplish when they put their minds to it. The debate went on for hours. Old grievances were aired and new possibilities were discussed. But eventually the conversation came down to a single question that cut through all the politics and emotion. Counselor Yunji from Europa Station was the one who finally said what everyone was thinking. She was young enough to have been born after the quarantine began. Her entire life had been shaped by humanity's forced independence. When she spoke, her voice carried a different perspective than the older representatives who remembered the rejection. The question is not whether they deserve our help. The question is what kind of species we want to be. Do we want to be the kind of people who let entire civilizations die because of old grudges? Or do we want to be the kind of people who do what is right regardless of how we have been treated? But then Sangmi asked the question that would define humanity's response. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the chamber. Everyone fell silent to hear her words. Fine. We will help them. But first I want to hear them answer one simple question. When you had every advantage, every resource, every technological marvel at your disposal and you still could not protect your own people, what excuse do you have? The chamber erupted in discussion again. Some thought the question was too harsh. Others felt it was exactly what needed to be asked. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge. Humanity would help the Council, but they would do it on their own terms and in their own way. They would not simply provide ships and soldiers to be wasted in the same failed strategies that had already proven useless. They would demand operational control and the freedom to use whatever methods they thought necessary. Most importantly, they would make the Council acknowledge what both species had learned over the past 21 years. That advancement and peace were luxuries that could be lost in an instant. That survival sometimes required qualities that civilized beings preferred to forget. That there were times when being dangerous and unpredictable was exactly what the situation demanded. The final vote was unanimous. Earth would respond to the Council's plea for help, but humanity's answer would come in the form of action rather than words. Admiral Minji received her orders within hours of the vote. She was to take the combined human fleet into Council space and do whatever was necessary to stop the Devourer advance. She would have complete tactical authority and the full support of every human military installation. Her first act was to send a message to Dalsu and the remaining Council leadership. The transmission was brief and to the point. Help is coming. Prepare your remaining forces for unconventional tactics. Humanity is about to show you what we learned during 21 years of isolation. We hope you are ready to see what happens when dangerous and unpredictable people decide to fight for something they believe in. The human fleet began moving toward the edge of the solar system within hours. Ships that had been designed for mining and construction were hastily converted for combat roles. Crews that had spent their careers building humanity's new civilization were now preparing to fight for its survival. But as the fleet departed Earth, one message was broadcast on all frequencies. It was addressed to any Council forces that might still be listening. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 21 years of human determination. We are coming. Hold the line. Gun-Ho led the first human fleet into Council space aboard the battleship Seoul. The ship had originally been built as a cargo hauler for the asteroid mines, but months of modifications had turned it into something entirely different. Kinetic railguns bristled from every available mounting point. Armor plating made from asteroid metals covered the hull in overlapping sections. The elegant curves that Council ships favored had been replaced by angular surfaces designed to deflect incoming fire. The Seoul looked like exactly what it was. A working ship built by people who understood that form should follow function, and that pretty things had a tendency to break when the shooting started. Behind Gun-Ho came the rest of humanity's war fleet, converted mining ships, heavy cargo haulers, and purpose-built patrol vessels that had been designed during the isolation years. None of them would win any awards for beauty, but every single one had been built to survive in the harsh environment of space where failure meant death. The contrast with Council vessels was immediately obvious when Gun-Ho's fleet reached the rendezvous point at the edge of what had once been Vorthak space. The few surviving council ships were sleek, elegant craft that moved through space like living art. Their hulls were polished to mirror brightness, and their design spoke of a civilization that valued perfection above all else. They were also falling, apart under the strain of constant combat. Commander Zalkun of the Kalani Defense Force met Gun-Ho aboard his flagship. The alien officer had once been magnificent with silver skin that flowed like liquid metal and 4 arms that moved in perfect coordination. Now he looked exhausted and defeated. His skin had lost its luster, and his movements were slow and uncertain. "Your arrival gives us hope, Admiral Gun-Ho. Our forces have been retreating for weeks. Every engagement results in the same outcome. Our weapons work for a brief time, then the Devourers adapt and our ships become helpless. We have lost over 80% of our combat strength." Gun-Ho studied the tactical displays that showed the current situation. The Devourer fleet was advancing steadily through what had once been the heart of Council civilization. Behind them lay dead systems stripped of all technology and most life. Ahead lay the remaining Council worlds and ultimately Earth itself. The alien commander gestured toward the holographic battle maps with one of his 4 arms. "We have tried everything. Concentrated firepower, coordinated attacks, surprise raids. Nothing works for more than a few hours. They learn from every engagement and adapt faster than we can develop new tactics." Gun-Ho nodded thoughtfully. He had spent the journey from Earth studying every available report about Devourer capabilities. The pattern was clear. The enemy was incredibly effective against standardized forces using centralized command structures and energy-based weapons. But they had never faced anything like human military doctrine. "Commander Zalkun, I appreciate the briefing, but my orders are to take operational control of all forces in this sector. Your ships will follow human tactical doctrine from now on. That means no more coordinated attacks, no more standardized formations, and definitely no more energy weapons." The alien officer looked confused. "But Admiral, those are the foundations of modern space combat. How do you expect to achieve victory without coordination and advanced weaponry?" Gun-Ho smiled grimly. "By fighting dirty." The human approach baffled Council observers from the very beginning. Instead of massing their forces, for overwhelming attacks, Gun-Ho split his fleet into dozens of small independent squadrons. Each group operated autonomously with its own objectives and tactics. There was no central command structure to disrupt, and no standardized approach for the Devourers to learn and counter. So-Min commanded one of these squadrons aboard a converted ice hauler that had been renamed the Busan. Her ships looked nothing like proper warships, but they had advantages that traditional military vessels lacked. Civilian ships were built to operate independently for months at a time. They had redundant systems, manual backups, and repair capabilities that allowed them to keep fighting, even after taking heavy damage. When So-Min's squadron encountered their first Devourer bioships, the engagement followed a pattern that would be repeated throughout human space. The enemy vessels immediately began draining power from any energy-based systems they could reach. Council ships would have been crippled within minutes, but human ships were different. The Busan's main weapons were kinetic railguns that used magnetic acceleration to fire chunks of asteroid metal at significant fractions of light speed. The diet power requirements were minimal, and the weapons themselves were essentially mechanical devices that could operate even if the ship's main power systems failed. When the Devourers tried to drain the railguns, they found nothing to drain. The weapons used stored energy from capacitor banks that could be charged manually if necessary. More importantly, each shot was a simple kinetic projectile that carried no electronics or energy fields that could be interfered with. The bioships tried to adapt to the kinetic attacks, but adaptation was much more difficult when facing purely physical projectiles. They could evolve defenses against energy weapons or electronic warfare, but they could not easily develop armor thick enough to stop chunks of metal moving at 10% of light speed. So-Min's first victory was small, but significant. Her squadron destroyed 3 Devourer vessels without losing a single human ship. More importantly, they proved that the enemy was not invincible when faced with tactics and weapons they had not encountered before. Jun-Ho demonstrated another aspect of human adaptability when his mining fleet encountered a larger Devourer formation near what had once been a Krillian colony world. His ships were not warships at all, but working vessels equipped with mining lasers, cutting tools, and ore processing equipment. When the Devourers began adapting to his initial attacks, Junho did something that no council commander had ever attempted. He changed his entire tactical approach in the middle of the battle. First, his crews used mining charges designed for breaking apart asteroids. When the bioships began developing resistance to chemical explosives, Junho switched to construction, lasers normally used for welding metal components. When those became ineffective, his team started firing ore processing equipment at the enemy ships. The constant changes in weapons and tactics prevented the Devourers from developing effective countermeasures. By the time they had adapted to mining charges, they were facing welding lasers. By the time they had learned to deal with welding lasers, they were being attacked with ore crushers and metal smelters. Junho's fleet consisted entirely of converted civilian vessels crewed by people who had never served in a military unit. But they had something that trained soldiers often lacked. They were used to solving problems with whatever tools were available, rather than following standardized procedures. Meanwhile, Hyejin was proving that human logistics could be just as revolutionary as human tactics. She commanded a fleet of rescue, ships that had been hastily converted from passenger liners and cargo haulers. Her mission was to evacuate Council civilians from worlds threatened by the Devourer advance. Traditional military doctrine called for dedicated transport vessels operating under heavy escort. But human ships were built differently. Every vessel in Hyejin's fleet could defend itself if necessary. More importantly, they were designed to operate in dangerous environments without support. When Hyejin's ships reached the Thessian core, worlds they found scenes of devastation that shocked even experienced human crews. Cities that had stood for thousands of years lay in ruins. Populations that had numbered in the billions were reduced to scattered survivors hiding in underground shelters. The Council evacuation ships had been forced to retreat when their escort vessels were destroyed. They could not risk approaching planets where Devourer forces might be present. Their elegant designs made them fast and efficient, but also fragile and dependent on external protection. Human rescue ships were built for industrial work in hostile environments. They had thick armor-redundant systems and the ability to land on planetary surfaces if necessary. When Devourer patrols attacked the evacuation sites, Hyejin's crews fought back with mining equipment, construction tools, and sheer determination. The contrast with Council capabilities was stark. Where elegant alien vessels had failed, ugly human ships succeeded through stubbornness and adaptability. But perhaps the most important difference was demonstrated by Chang Ho and his engineering teams. When Council equipment failed, it usually required factory-level facilities to repair or replace. The centralized nature of their technology meant that complex systems could only be maintained by specialists using specialized tools and materials. Human technology was designed by people who understood that help might not be available when things broke down. Every important system had manual backups. Critical components could be repaired using common tools and materials. Most importantly, human crews were trained to improvise solutions rather than follow maintenance manuals. Chang Ho's engineers proved this repeatedly as the campaign progressed. When Council ships suffered damage, they had to retreat to rear areas for repairs that might take weeks or months. When human ships suffered damage, their crews fixed them on the spot using whatever materials were available. A human destroyer that lost its main weapons could be back in action within hours using spare parts cannibalized from other systems. A Council cruiser with similar damage would be out of action until it could return to a proper repair facility. The cumulative effect of these differences was greater than anyone had expected. Human forces were not more advanced than Council fleets. Their individual ships were not more powerful than alien vessels. But their ability to adapt, improvise, and continue fighting under adverse conditions gave them advantages that the Devourers had never encountered before. For the first time since the invasion began, the enemy advance was being slowed, and in some sectors actually reversed. Human squadrons were winning engagements that Council forces could not even survive. More importantly, they were learning from each battle and developing new tactics faster than the Devourers could adapt to them. The galaxy was discovering what 21 years of isolation had taught humanity about survival. When everything else failed, humans improvised. When their plans fell apart, they made new ones. When their equipment broke, they fixed it with whatever was available. Most importantly, they never gave up. Even when facing impossible odds, human crews kept fighting, kept adapting, kept finding new ways to accomplish their missions. It was exactly the kind of dangerous, unpredictable behavior that the Council had rejected 2 decades earlier. Now it was the only thing standing between them and extinction. The final battle began at what had once been the Council's greatest military stronghold. Fortress Arcturus had been built over centuries to protect the heart of galactic civilization. Its defensive platforms could withstand the explosion of stars. Its weapon arrays could crack planets. Its shields had never been breached in 3,000 years of operation. Now it was the last major installation standing between the Devourers and the remaining Council worlds. Kyung-Soo commanded the combined fleet from the bridge of the battleship Incheon. Around him moved the largest human military force ever assembled. 500 converted civilian vessels supported by 200 purpose-built warships. Behind them came the remnants of the Council fleet's battered survivors of dozens of defeats, who had learned to follow human tactical doctrine or die. The fortress itself was a monument to Council engineering. Massive structures stretched across an entire star system connected by energy bridges that spanned millions of kilometers. Automated defense networks could track and destroy thousands of targets simultaneously. The central command complex housed the greatest military minds of 47 different species. It was also exactly the kind of target that the Devourers were designed to destroy. The enemy fleet that approached Arcturus was unlike anything the Yaize galaxy had seen before. Bioships the size of moons moved through space like living organisms. Their hulls rippled and shifted as they adapted to different forms of attack. Energy discharges crawled across their surfaces like lightning trapped in organic matter. Behind the massive bioships came smaller vessels that moved in coordinated swarms. These were the scouts and infiltrators that had learned to counter every form of technology the Council possessed. They could drain power from fusion reactors, disable quantum communication networks, and turn advanced weapon systems against their owners. Traditional military doctrine called for defending the fortress. Platforms with overwhelming firepower. The Council commanders wanted to mass their remaining ships around the most heavily defended positions and fight a conventional engagement. Kyung-Soo had different ideas. Instead of protecting the centralized defense platforms, he ordered his forces to create a network of small mobile bases throughout the system. Each position could operate independently without relying on the fortress's main power grid or communication systems. More importantly, each base was equipped with purely mechanical backup systems that could function even if their electronics were completely disabled. The Council observers were horrified by this approach. They watched human crews dismantling precision-built defense networks and replacing them with crude mechanical systems. They saw automated weapon platforms being stripped of their advanced targeting systems and converted to manual operation. But Ji Young understood what Kyung-Soo was doing. She had been coordinating ground defense preparations on the fortress's main platforms. Her teams were human Marines armed with kinetic weapons and mechanical equipment that looked primitive compared to Council military technology. The aliens had given her access to energy weapons that could vaporize targets at the molecular level. They had offered her force fields that could deflect any known form of attack. They had provided her with combat suits that could enhance human strength and reflexes to superhuman levels. She had turned it all down. Instead, her Marines carried spring-loaded rifles that fired metal projectiles using mechanical energy stored in compressed coils. They wore armor made from layered metal plates that could stop kinetic impacts, but had no electronic components that could be disabled. Their communication equipment consisted of fiber optic cables and manual signal devices that required no external power. When the Council military advisors asked her why she was rejecting their advanced technology, Ji Young gave them an answer that they would remember for the rest of their lives. Because when your advanced technology fails, my primitive equipment will still work. The Devourer assault began with their standard pattern. The bioships approached the fortress while smaller vessels moved to drain power from the defensive systems. Energy weapons fell silent as their power sources were somehow siphoned away. Communication networks collapsed as the quantum relay systems went dead. Automated defenses shut down one by one as their control systems were overwhelmed. Within the first hour of battle, the greatest military installation in galactic history had been reduced to a collection of powerless structures drifting in space. The massive energy bridges that connected different sections of the fortress went dark. The command centers lost contact with their defensive platforms. The weapon arrays that could crack planets became nothing more than expensive decorations. It was exactly what the Devourers expected. This was how they had conquered every other Council stronghold. They had learned to turn advanced technology into a liability by simply removing the power that made it function. But as the bioships moved in for the final assault, they discovered that the fortress was not as helpless as it appeared. From hidden positions throughout the system, human weapons opened fire. Kinetic railguns that had been powered down to avoid detection suddenly came online using stored energy from mechanical capacitor systems. The projectiles they fired carried no electronic signatures that could be detected or jammed. They were simply chunks of metal accelerated to tremendous velocities by magnetic forces. The bioships tried to adapt to the kinetic attacks, but they had no experience with weapons that used purely mechanical energy storage. Their usual tactic of draining power from enemy systems was useless against capacitors that could be recharged manually if necessary. More importantly, the human defensive network was decentralized in a way that the Devourers had never encountered. There was no central command structure to disrupt. Each weapon platform operated independently using mechanical targeting systems that required no external communication. Destroying one position had no effect on the others. Seokjin had been working on the fortress modifications for weeks leading up to the battle. As a former mining engineer, he understood systems that had to work reliably in hostile environments without support. He had replaced the fortress's elegant automated systems with crude mechanical backups that could be operated manually if necessary. The Council engineers had been horrified by his modifications. They watched him strip out precision-built control networks and replace them with manual systems that looked like they belonged in a museum. They saw him disconnect advanced power distribution systems and install mechanical alternatives that required constant human attention to operate. But when the Devourers drained power from the fortress's main systems, Seokjin's mechanical backups kept working. Human crews operated weapons manually using mechanical controls that required no external power. They loaded ammunition by hand and aimed their guns using optical sights that could not be jammed or disabled. The battle turned into exactly the kind of chaotic engagement that humans excelled at, and the Devourers had never learned to handle. Instead of facing a unified defense network, they were fighting dozens of independent units, each using different tactics and weapons. Human crews switched from kinetic weapons to chemical explosives to improvised projectiles made from construction materials. When one type of ammunition proved ineffective, they simply changed to something else. When their primary weapons were damaged, they repaired them using spare parts cannibalized from other systems. The constant adaptation prevented the Devourers from developing effective countermeasures. By the time they had learned to defend against railgun projectiles, they were facing chemical rockets. By the time they had adapted to chemical explosives, they were being attacked with construction equipment converted to combat roles. The turning point came when human ground forces proved that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. When Devourer, infiltrator organisms breached the fortress's outer defenses, they expected to face Council troops armed with energy weapons and protected by force fields. Instead, they found human Marines using equipment that their ancestors might have recognized. Spring-loaded weapons that fired metal projectiles, armor made from layers of metal plates, communication systems that consisted of humans shouting at each other across mechanical intercom networks. The infiltrator organisms tried to drain power from the human equipment and found nothing to drain. They tried to disrupt the communication networks and discovered that humans could coordinate attacks by simply talking to each other. They tried to adapt to human weapons and found that mechanical systems could not be changed by biological interference. For the first time since the invasion began, the Devourers were fighting an enemy that their adaptations could not counter. Human technology was too crude and mechanical to be disabled by their usual methods. Human tactics were too chaotic and decentralized to be predicted or prevented. As the last Devourer bioship fell to a barrage of human kinetic weapons, the Council representatives finally understood what they had missed 21 years earlier. The species they had rejected as too dangerous and unpredictable had just saved galactic civilization using exactly those qualities. Inho spoke for the human coalition as the combined fleets regrouped after the battle. He had been chosen as humanity's spokesman because he understood both military tactics and diplomatic language. His message was broadcast to every remaining council world and recorded for galactic history. You asked us what excuse we have. The answer is that we do not need excuses. When the lights went out and your technology failed and your advanced civilizations crumbled, we did not make excuses. We made do. We adapted. We survived. That is what humans do. The galaxy that emerged from the Devourer War was very different from the one that had rejected humanity decades earlier. The Council's centralized government had collapsed under the weight of the crisis. Their standardized technology had proven vulnerable to an enemy that could adapt faster than they could innovate. But humanity's decentralized approach had proven remarkably resilient. Human colonies throughout the galaxy continued to operate independently, even when cut off from outside support. Human ships kept fighting even after losing their primary systems. Human crews found ways to accomplish impossible missions using whatever resources were available. The rebuilding process would take decades, but it would follow human principles rather than council doctrine. Redundant systems would replace elegant efficiency. Manual backups would support automated processes. Local autonomy would replace centralized control. Miran became the new Galactic Relations Director, as the various species worked to establish a new form of interstellar cooperation. The Council's application to join humanity's growing coalition was still under review, but the process was very different from the old system. Instead of judging species based on their technological advancement or cultural sophistication, the new alliance evaluated them based on their ability to adapt, survive, and contribute to the common defense. The universe was not safe, and it was not fair. The question was not what excuse a species had when things went wrong. The question was what they were going to do about it. The final irony was not lost on anyone who had lived through both the rejection and the salvation. The galaxy had been saved by the very qualities that had once been considered too dangerous for civilized society. Violence and unpredictability had proven more valuable than peace and standardization when survival was at stake. Humanity had finally found its place among the stars, not as the junior member of an advanced civilization, but as the stubborn survivors, who could be counted on when everything else failed. They had proven that sometimes being crude and mechanical and hopelessly primitive was exactly what the situation demanded. And when the next crisis came, as everyone knew it, eventually would, the galaxy would be ready with redundant systems, manual backups, and the most dangerous quality of all, human adaptability.